The sea rasped at the stones of Bear Island as if it meant to gnaw the rock down to a fist. Wind shuddered the mossy shutters and worried the pine smoke so that the rafters breathed and the banners over the high table stirred like a row of sleeping dogs. Jon Snow warmed his hands around a dented cup. The broth within smelled of onions and kelp and some white fish that broke to flakes. He had eaten nothing since dawn, and the hollow in him felt less like hunger than like space hollowed by loss. Across the high table, Lady Lyanna Mormont stood on a stool to reach the carved board. The map was old, the wood warped. The inlet of Deepwood Mott grooved deep by a hand that had known the lay of the land before Robert Baratheon had taken a stag to the breast. Pine cones served as armies. Driftwood chips were ships. She tapped the pine cones with 2 fingers, brisk as a woodpecker. "Your free folk don't wear helms," she said. "So they see well. Put them in the vanguard where the snow will be unbroken. If Bolton wants to taunt us with his horses, he'll have to ride over ground the free folk have felt first." Davos Seaworth leaned his elbows against the table's edge, the noon light laying his face in blue shadow. "And us honest crawlers with helmets and noses that feel the cold, my lady?" Lyanna glanced at him. Her face was too still to be a child's face, but her hair was still plaited like a girl's, woven through with a strip of green cloth. "You keep the wings, Ser Davos. You remind the lords that their men are not their banners. You hold them when they bolt." Sansa sat near the fire with her hands folded. She had not taken off her gloves, and the fur at the wrists was crisp white as new snow. "If Lord Bolton's numbers are as Lord Glover says, we cannot win by clever lines on a board." Lyanna slid a driftwood chip along the carved coast. "We can win by not dying before he does." She looked up, straight at Jon. She had the Mormont eyes, almost black, that stared as if looking through weather. "The point is to break him. We don't have to break all of him at once." The hall murmured, a ripple of men in mail shifting like a sack of nails. Yora's name did not travel on any lips. Meege Mormont was dead, and the weight of the bear's head hammer still hung above the hearth. But the old songs were in the grain of the beams. Bear Island was not made to be impressed. Jon set down his cup. "My lady," he said, 3 houses promised us men this morning, and 5 told us to go back to Castle Black and shut the gates. I have too few for a straight fight, too many for a quiet raid." He felt Sansa's eyes on him, felt Davos's patience like a hand at his shoulder. He looked at the men who had come to serve House Mormont and the Stark name. Thick-armed fishermen, girls with plates and long knives, old men with heavy shoulders. He said, "You've given us 62, and I've seen what 62 from Bear Island can do." A smile flicked and died on Lyanna's mouth. "But I've asked you and your men for more than spears. If we win back Winterfell, we'll be surrounded by enemies. I need more than a vanguard and a wing." "You need a spine," Lyanna said, matter of fact. "Something to hold everything together once the first blood starts to steam." She touched a pine cone with her fingertip and set it down near the skull across the board where a carver had once gouged a mountain. The board accepted the piece without a sound. The silence in the hall was not the heavy, angry silence Jon had learned to dread. It was the silence of men listening to a storm's voice under the eaves. Jon said, very plain, so his own uncertainty could not thin it, "Lady Lyanna, I would like you to be my field general." Even the wind seemed to hesitate. Then a scatter of voices, a scrape of bench legs on the slate. A heavy man from Deepwood swore softly. Someone laughed and swallowed it. Davos's head tipped, just so. Sansa's hands stilled utterly and her gloves creaked. Lyanna didn't move. Her eyes had narrowed, not in pride, not offended, not pleased. She was measuring the shape of the words as if they were a boat under construction and she was checking how the ribs would lie. "You're serious," she said finally. "I would not jest with the lives of the North," Jon said. Davos asked in his gray shipman's tone, "What would such a post require of the lady?" "Everything," Lyanna said, before Jon could answer. She stepped down from the stool and the distance between her eyes and his chest was a startling thing. A smallness that felt like an insult to the world. She walked around the board and stood before Jon. So near he saw a freckle on her cheekbone and the seam lines where her gloves had been mended. "If you name me that, I answer to the plan, not to men's tempers. I won't be commanded to throw lives at a gate to satisfy anyone's hurt. Do you understand me, Snow?" The name had weight but no malice. John thought of how it had felt to die in the cold and dark and the way he had learned to make decisions from inside the tightness of a chest. He said, "I understand, and I'll speak to every lord who brings men." Lyanna went on, "They'll swear to take their field orders from me as if I were their own lord. If they won't, send them home. I won't have men in our lines who decide the parts they like and leave the rest for other men to bleed into the snow." That drew a cough from some corner, a scrape of mail. Davos's mouth bent like a sail catching wind. Sansa's gaze fell and rose again, quick as a hawk looking at a rabbit and the rabbit looking back. Jon said, "If any man would not swear to obey the general in the field, he will not stand in our lines. You can't expect Lord Manderley or—" A man began from the benches, shaking his head so the iron rings of his coif rasped. "I can," Jon said. "If they would follow me, they will follow the general I name." Lyanna nodded once, as if a negotiating point had been settled. "So be it," she said. "But there's more. If we win Winterfell, we're not done. We don't get to name what comes next, but we get to be ready for it. I'll need carpenters and blacksmiths more than I'll need poets. Dragonglass has to be cut into arrowheads. I'll need messengers who don't panic. And I need to speak to the Lord of White Harbor. He can count and he has ships. If he thinks feeding me and mine will ruin his stores, he'll pretend not to hear the shouting from the wall." Davos chuckled under his breath. "The girl names the work, my lord," he said, not quite hiding the pride in it. Sansa said carefully, "We won't win men by insulting them, my lady." Lyanna looked at her. "We won't keep them by flattering them," she said. Snow hissed across the courtyard when the doors opened. A houseman stepped forward. He had a scar running down through his brow like a rivulet. "The ravens, my lady," he said. "Lord Glover's man brought his bird and took our message. He brought a letter with him." He held it out to Lyanna on his palm, like an offering. She didn't take it. She glanced at Jon. He saw parchment and sealing wax in dirty fingers and thought he would rather not read any more words that said no. "Read it," he said. The houseman broke the seal and squinted. He had the letter 2 inches from his face. "Lord Glover says he made mistake," he read haltingly. "He says the Ironborn with Theon Greyjoy took Deepwood Motte when the king in the north took south, and he begs the pardon of no. He says he'll come with men. He'll stand the line. He writes it so I will stand the line. He writes it twice." A murmur. A relief that was not joy but the loosening of a belt on a man too full of grief. Lyanna took the letter and folded it neat. When she slid it into her sleeve, the men in the hall saw her as she was already, and that was something like a pole star the night before a long sail. Jon did not realize he had smiled until his face warmed. "Then we begin," Lyanna said. "Bring me Lord Glover's steward, and Manderley's. Send word to White Harbor that their fattest man is about to be put on an honest diet. Tell them we'll pay in salt and victory songs if we live long enough to sing them." The hall laughed for the first time, a northern laugh. Rough, unwilling but grateful. She lifted her chin. "I need to speak to the Lord of the Eyrie as well. The Knights of the Vale do not love the Boltons. They love to ride. That makes them useful, if they will be used." Sansa's glove creaked again. Jon saw her mouth part and close. He remembered her voice a night before, stiff with held-back words. "You don't know him," she had said of Ramsay. "You don't know what he is." He wanted to tell her he did not need to know Ramsay's private horrors to know the way he would fight. He wanted to tell her he could guess at the private horrors all the same. Instead, he said nothing at all. After the hall had emptied to the business of sharpening, after Davos had taken the measure of stores and salt pork and the number of working cart wheels, after Sansa had walked once around the inner yard and back to the hearth and warmed her hands again, Lyanna returned to the table and set the conewoods where the map told her north was north and hard ground was hard. She stood on tiptoe and spoke without looking up. "He'll try to take your brother and make you run yourself to death to catch him. she said. He will not bring Rickon under a flag of truce unless it is his. He wants to break your breath. Jon felt heat pass through his skin, shame and fury in equal portions. He will not have that, he said. Then don't give it, she said, finally looking at him. Send men tonight to cut down trees northwest of the field and dig as many trenches as their backs can bear. We'll pin their horses. We'll force their shield wall to come for us on ground that heaps under their feet. They like their rounds neat and their killing tidied. We'll mess it. We have no time, Sansa said, but without strength. And Jon was startled to hear the hope in that, the memory of a girl who had taken faith in order, in small courtesies, in breakfasts served in courses. She was colder now, but she liked neatness still, or wanted to. We have enough, Lyanna said, and Jon thought how often the North had said that, through the long winters. Enough turnips to get to the cold, enough river ice to get the wheel across, enough men to carry the stones. She looked at him and said flat, "And if you have other friends, Lord Snow, tell them now or we won't count them." Sansa's breath changed. He did not look at her. "We have the wildlings," he said. "We have the North." Lyanna didn't press. Jon understood that silence too. His love for Sansa was not less for the knowledge that she kept something of her own. He knew about keeping things of his own. If she meant to bring him an arrow from behind a shield later, he would take it then. For now he took what lay before him and let the rest be. If he had learned anything in command, it was to look only as far ahead as the land would let him. Before dawn the next day, the beaches rang with the voices of axes. Bear Island men were forest men as well as fishers. They felled pine as if they were cutting masts. Trenches went in the half-frozen dirt like wounds. Lyanna walked the lines in a bearskin cloak too big for her, her hair half loosened by the wind, and when men bowed she acted as if she had not seen it, and so saved them their backs. Tormund Giantsbane came into camp with a frost-rimed beard and eyes as bright as fire in the snow. "Little she-bear," he said when Lyanna turned to him, nothing in his tone to make the words small. "They say you bite." Lyanna's mouth twitched. "Only when the meat is not worth chewing," she said. Tormund laughed like tearing cloth. They rode south with weather breaking before them like old glass. Lord Glover met them with his men. Wyman Manderly sent a garrison and more wagons than Jon had thought he owe. Ned all groaning under sacks of barley and barrels of salted cod, and the fat lord's letter was full of flourishes about Stark honor and the wrongs done to the north, but Lyanna said, folding it, "He smells the wind." That's enough. They camped within sight of the Winterfell walls 2 nights later. The sigil that flew from the ramparts was the flayed man, stark against a sky metal gray. Jon stood on a low rise and remembered how the banners used to climb there with the wind playing under them, the dire wolf laughing in the sun. He remembered Robb's command voice and the quiet, unsmiling pride of the men when they heard it. He remembered coming to the gate as a boy with muddy boots and hearing the stable master curse and smile. He remembered the kitchen's rosemary smoke and the snow that came soft some nights, like a gift. The memory was a sword's edge, not a blanket. He wrapped his hands around it anyway. Ramsay Bolton rode out to taunt at sunset with a dozen riders and a flag of pale blue. He wore a foxfur cloak and a smile that made Jon's teeth ache. With him rode men whose eyes looked at nothing and men who watched whether Ramsay breathed before they breathed. "You!" Ramsay called, reining up where the ditch began, where the ground was churned by the day's work and damp. "Bastard snow! I wondered if you had the courage to come down from your wall." Lyanna stood 3 paces behind Jon. She had refused to sit on a horse. She said she preferred the way her feet felt the ground. If Ramsay saw a child, he did not say so. He smiled at Jon the way a cat looks at a new string. "Bring me my brother and you can die quickly," Jon said. The words tasted like old iron. Ramsay's smile widened a hair. "You'll have him," he said. "Run along now. You'll want to be ready to catch." He turned his mare with a flick and cantered back to the flayed man ranks. Laughter rose like crows from his men. Lyanna regarded the trenches as if they were a lesson in a book. "He's going to show you he can make you move when he wants," she said softly. "Stand where I tell you to stand." At dawn, with a sun as thin as a coin, Ramsay did bring Rickon. He led the boy out by the wrist and cut the rope with an easy flick. A wave went over John's skin, heat as if the snow itself burned. Rickon looked lost within himself, legs that had grown faster than his heart, hair snarled, eyes wide and nearsighted with fear. John took an involuntary step and Lyanna's hand found the inside of his elbow like the iron ring of a nail in a plank. "No," she said, hardly any sound at all. Ramsay called, "Run!" and Rickon ran. He ran like boys run, like a deer learns to sprint because the dog's breath is on it. An arrow came and fell short. Another arrow. The line of fletching and the line of the boy. The way the air between a brother's eyes and another brother's skin is shorter than any measure of ground. John's horse bawled under him. He tasted salt and iron in his mouth, and it might have been blood or tears. The arrows came, and the last one, and Rickon fell forward into the white in a faint way, as if someone had cut the string on a marionette. The roar in John's head was a sea. He would have kicked, would have gone tearing at the ditch and the stakes and the plan, but the hand on his elbow tightened until the bone through the sleeve creaked. "Stand," Lyanna said, and there was something in that small voice that was more than orders. It was an oath. It was the winter itself saying no to a thaw. "Let me save the rest of them if I can't save him." He did not know how he obeyed. The world had narrowed to white and the black hair of the boy in the snow and the fox fur on the high saddle and his own breath drawing him back from a cliff. Lyanna moved away from his side without a sound. Her signaler raised a horn and blew 3 notes, one climbing, 2 quick. Men who had never heard those notes before remembered them anyway. Men who had never stood under a shield together lifted the shields until the line made a new rib for the army. The ditches choked with brush. The stakes leaned in the half-frozen earth and the ropes were tugged until they bit. The free folk went forward in a thick clump and threw spears long as rafters. Ramsay's cavalry broke across the ground at a gallop, and again the sound of their hooves was not thunder. It was a drum made of meat. They hit the first trench at an angle and the front horses screamed. The men behind shoved through anyway, and the long legs of the horses found holes where the earth had looked flat. Some men tumbled into water, some fell with their legs at angles no leg should fall. Where the line of free folk stood, the spears set, the horses tried to leap and found air. Tormund ran with his battered axe, laughing, and cut a man's knee so that the horse went down over him like a door in a storm. John gave his first order with a mouth dry as salt. He sent the reserve up where Lyanna had marked a small rise on the map as if it meant nothing. A swell of dirt with a copse of birch. Bear Island archers lurked there now under white cloaks that made their outlines break like bad memories. They shot low, not for heroics, but to cut hamstrings and drop horses, to break momentum, to make the field a mess. They did not cheer at the kills. They shot, and when their quivers were empty, girls with braids came running up from the cookfires with more. The Bolton infantry advanced as Ramsay had made them practice. Their line was neat, shields nearly touching, spears bristling. The neatness faltered where the ground heaved under their boots. Lyanna sent the signal for the wings and Davos's voice bellowed iron. Men moved who had never moved in concert before. The bolts of the Bolton crossbows struck. Men fell, the lines knit around the tearing. John's world narrowed and widened in waves. He felt the way the army breathed, and the breath went down his spine like a pole and into the ground. He felt the place where Rickon lay an ember in the white. He felt Lyanna across the field like a small dark star, not one that warmed but one that fixed direction. They would have broken then, John thought afterwards, if not for the Knights of the Vale. Either Lyanna's ravens had flown true or a man not named in any letter had decided to move without asking permission. John saw, at the far end of the field, spears glinting in the pale sun like the backs of fish when they turn. He heard a noise like a distant waterfall, and Jon Royce's banner came over the brow of a drift. The Vale charged clean and fresh into Ramsay's flank, and what was neat became shredded. One roared and broke their gait like a man snapping twigs from kindling. John saw Ramsay run wet-faced with fear across the yard toward the kennels and knew, in a bright instant, that some order of the world had reasserted itself. He did not feel triumph. He felt tired enough to weep and too stubborn to weep. When he found Ramsay in the hall where the dogs had fed, he did what was required and nothing more. They brought Rickon in wrapped in a cloak that had once been Rob's and laid him in the cold crypts with a candle in his hands. The stones smelled of damp and grief. John sat on the step and rested his forearms on his knees and listened to the beeswax drip and harden on the flagstones. Lyanna stood 2 steps below him, her hands clasped tight at her middle. Her cheeks were gray. She did not say, "I told you so." She did not say anything at all. When the northern lords gathered in the great hall with its banners righted and the wolf's head over the hearth, men who had grumbled at the girl on a stool were eager to tell stories about where they had stood when her orders made sense out of their fear. Lyanna let them talk. When the room had filled with the warmth of men alive in ashen hope, she lifted her chin and spoke her true piece, and the words went from mouth to mouth across the crowded benches and out into the yard and up to the ramparts where men could not hear but wanted to. She named John as the man who had paid his due to the North in blood and held to his name when names were traded cheap. She did not flatter. She said what was true like an axe makes it stroke. She shamed lords whose banners had flown low and praised men whose boots had bled, and when the chant began King in the North, it did not sound as if it had been waiting in someone's throat since boyhood. It sounded like a thing made new and hard and necessary. After that day, John was never comfortable under a crown. He let it sit on the table when he could and wore it only when it made other men behave. He gave Lyanna an office that had not existed for any northern woman in 300 years, and if anyone wondered at it too loudly, he sent them to the yard to watch Bear Island girls box with the wildlings until their wonder cooled. The winter gathered its skirts around Winterfell and sat. The work Lyanna had named was dull and saving. Men dug ditches deeper. Carpenters planed rough pine into palisade stakes until their gloves wore through. Davos rode to White Harbor to barter salted fish for iron nails, and Wyman Manderley smiled like the moon and counted casks against promises. John learned to sleep in snatches like he had on the wall. Sansa learned to send ravens like she had been born to it. Lyanna learned the names of every steward worth a curse between the neck and the shivering sea. News traveled in jars of ink and bags of wax. Cersei Lannister had burned her enemies and their crowded sept together and put a crown upon her unlovely head. The wall stood. The dead walked beyond it. Samwell Tarly sent a letter that smelled faintly of the dust of books, telling where the old records hid a name for black stone that could burn the dead like straw, dragonglass, and telling where it lay in heaps on an island of old name Dragonstone. Lyanna read the letter twice, pursed her lips as if she'd bitten into a sour berry, and sent a list of smiths to be excused from levy work and put to edges. She did not approve the plan to go catch a dead thing beyond the wall. When the arguing had ended and the men who wanted their names to be part of songs had their way, she followed John to the yard and walked at his shoulder where no one else would hear. "You can't be the one to fall into the river," she said. "If you drown, I'll have to stab the world with a knife and it won't die." "There's no one else," he said, and he meant it. It did not matter that it was foolish. He could not let other men do a thing he would not do. She nodded once, as if she had known exactly how his folly would dress itself. "Then you'll trip the rope before you start," she said. "You'll leave watchers every half-mile with horns and fire and hares in sacks. When you run, they'll run, and if the ice takes you, they'll pull you out by the ankles. You'll take rope enough to spiral the gods would twice. You'll take dogs that understand to be quiet. You'll take no one who thinks a tale is worth a life that can be spent once only." He smiled at her hard. "And if I promise and don't do it?" he asked. She bared her teeth, which was as close to a smile as she came on war days. "I'll find where your bones wash up and hit them with a stick." The mission was as cold and stupid as Lyanna had named it, and some of the men John loved were dead afterwards, and Viserion died and the wall fell. But more of them lived than would have without the ropes and the watchers and the dogs that had been taught to lie flat and make no sound. And John came home with a hollow in him that the frost laid in and that never melted. The dead came like downhill water. Not in one wave, but in cold gulping surges that swallowed villages and left fences whitening in the next sunrise. Lyanna obeyed none of the commanders she had seen in old books. When the Dothraki arrived, proud and hot-eyed and eager, She set them to run not forward in a clean wave but in swarms across he edges of the fields, harrying, slitting, circling back, never letting the dead bunch to a crushing mass. When the unsullied, perfect in their straight lines, marched, she put them between trenches and palisades where their neatness made barriers instead of graves. She took the lightest armored men and gave them torches and had them race the trenches in patterns she had taught them, setting fire in arcs and chevrons so that the dragons could see where to burn without becoming silhouettes against their own flame. She put a Bear Island girl called Netta in the crypt with 30 shields and as many dragonglass knives and told her very simply what would happen if the old ones woke and how not to scream. When the long night came to Winterfell, the sky was the color of old ashes and the wind did not smell like anything. The snow muffled even the dragons, who passed like stones thrown under a lake. Men stood where Lyanna had put them and did what she had taught them. Fear ran through them and did not spill them. She did not imagine a battle would look like a carving. Therefore, when it did not, she was ready for the brokenness. The first wave hit the palisades and did not stop because dead men do not feel splinters, and the palisades cracked and torches fell, and she sent girls to pick up the torches and put them in other hands without fuss. Jon fought where the fighting had meaning and pulled back when he had to. He had thought once that commanding meant standing where the line met and bleeding. He learned that commanding meant knowing which bleeding mattered. He rallied men who could still rally and let those who could not lie. He used the dragons to sigh the path where the dead had thickened to something like cloth. He watched Lyanna from above just once. A small figure at the base of the inner wall, a banner far too large for her height, jerking left and right to signal to the hornmen. It looked absurd and perfect. He wanted to laugh with relief and cry with the terror of how close it all lay. A white bear burst through one of the choke points with steam roiling off its hide where the pitch had not caught. Lyanna met it not with her spear but with a hook attached to a rope that looped and bit at the dead thing's foreleg. Men hauled on the rope and the bear faltered, and she drove the spear up, not into the chest, which any man would do, but into the mouth, which a Bear Island girl knew was where the throat was tender. The beast fell back into the narrow where the fire waited. The men hauling the rope did not shout. They breathed and hauled and let go on her signal. Arya moved through the mess like a bad memory you don't want but cannot shake. Lyanna watched for her without seeming to watch, the way a hunter watches for a fox by watching birds. When the Night King's host had pressed so near the godswood that the red leaves shivered under their breath, Lyanna took 20 men and sent them the long way by the old gardener's wall and told them there was a space under an arch where men had smoked in summer in her father's lifetime, and that a small dark figure could go through there unseen if the world wanted it. She did not move toward the godswood herself. She stood in the courtyard and kept the lines from running. It was not her knife to put to the King of Winter. It was enough, more than enough, to keep the door open long enough for the knife meant for him to find him. When it was done, and the shards of him were melting into the snow like salt, she sank onto a stair with her cloak around her shoulders and sat for the space of 10 breaths. She did not cry, not because she would not, but because she was not finished. Then she rose and began counting because counting was a kind of mourning the living could do while the dead lay down. After the dawn that followed the long night, thin, filthy, as if the sky had been refused a bath, there were more decisions. Jon found that battles were, if anything, the least of them. The air over Winterfell tasted of wet cinders and horses. The yard was slick with melted snow and melted men. Sansa walked through the smoldering ruin with her cloak held close and her hair unbound because she had been too busy to think of it that morning. People came to thank them, and people came to curse the cold, and people came to ask what to do with their hands now that they were not holding spears. Lyanna took the northern men who had survived and set them to be something like an army that could live with itself. She taught signals to boys who had thought they would be shepherds and stuck them on palisades in rain until they understood that 3 long blasts meant withdraw and no amount of pride would change what the horn said. She took girls who had fed the kettles at the rear and put them on horses and had them ride routes between watchfires, and made them repeat news until their tongues learned to be truthful rather than flattering. She sent men whose hands shook to the kitchens, not as punishment, but because she had eyes to see where a man could be useful that had nothing to do with swords. She made the iron and sackcloth shape of what the people of the north would call, in years that went by, the Bear's Line. Ships came north that spring, spring by the North's calendar. By anyone else's it would have been winter still, with dragon sails, and with them came a queen with hair like wheat and eyes like summer's sea. Daenerys Targaryen stood under Winterfell's gray sky with chapped lips and cheeks windburned 2 shades darker than the rest of her face. She did not kneel. Sansa did not curtsy. Jon's shoulders took on an old tightness. Lyanna regarded the Dragon Queen as she would a stranger come to Bear Island with a spear to trade. With interest, without awe, with a chin that made the stranger prove herself. "I am Lyanna Mormont," she said, "Field General for the North." Daenerys's mouth made a shape that would have been laughter somewhere warmer. "You are very young." "Gee," she said, not unkind. "I am very necessary," Lyanna replied, and then, because it was truth and not flattery, "You are too, if words say true. I'm glad to see your dragon's teeth. I'll be gladder if your men listen to horns." Grey Worm, standing at the queen's shoulder like a sharpened pole, said in his precise accent, "Unsullied obey." Lyanna nodded. "Then they'll be easier than the men with their own names," she said. She walked the queen through the yard as if Winterfell were her home and not Jon's, never raising her voice, pointing with 2 fingers, telling in a line where men would stand if men needed to stand again. Daenerys listened without interrupting, which made Lyanna like her. "Do you always call your lords by the orders you give them?" Tyrion Lannister asked later over warm ale that tasted of the cask and the iron of the cup. Lyanna sipped, made a face, and wiped her mouth with the back of her glove. "If I call them by their names, they remember their grandfathers," she said. "If I call them by their work, they do it." "You'll make friends of men who think of their coats first," Tyrion said. Lyanna's look was as sharp as a fish knife. "I don't want friends," she said. "I want the North alive when the snow melts." The snow did melt. Not this year, not next, but in time. Before that could happen, men with crowns they had put on their own heads demanded that the North spend itself on their arguments. Cersei Lannister sent golden words up the King's Road that were hollow within, promising alliances that meant garrisons and mercy that meant a ledger. Jon heard them and scowled. Sansa heard them and smiled thinly and said they were what she expected. Lyanna heard them and made lists of things that would burn when lit and things that would rot when wet, because war is a matter of supplies as much as a matter of speeches. She did not want to go south. It was not her land. But when Jon and Daenerys and Tyrion laid out their arguments in a firelit room with iron hooks on the walls that had once held boar hams, she did what she had done since the night she put a pine cone on a warped map and refused to be small. "You'll need someone to mind the men you call your own when you are in rooms that make you forget their breathing," she said. "I'll go with you. I don't have to like it." The ride down the King's Road was a lesson in how the world broke and knit. Villages blackened or boarded. Farmers whose faces were leather. A child with hair so fair it was nearly white running beside the road with a stick pretending to be a sword. Lyanna watched and made notes that were not written. How long a cart could go between the springs, how many geese in a yard, how men looked at the dragons when they passed and whether fear turned to awe. King's Landing stank of hot stone and piss. The Dragon Queen's face went still when she saw the city she had been born for, and Jon hated it as he had always hated it, instinctively and without argument. Lyanna stood on a balcony with a guard pressing his lips together to swallow laughter at the sight of a child peering over carved stone at a city. She did not ask questions. She said, "You could take it by fire. I know you can. The question is what's left, and who you ask to live with it." Daenerys did not answer then. Lyanna did not speak again on that topic until the bells rang and the queen's face changed and the world set on fire. In the moment before the bells began, those uneasy bells, uncertain as the hands that pulled their ropes, Lyanna stood in a crush of northern men in the outer ward with their shields at their sides and sweat running past dust into their eyes. Grey Worm stood opposite with men who were made for commands and for killing. The word came down the line. "If the bells ring, you will stop." An hour later the bells rang, jangling and atonal, and men let out breaths and smiles and prayers. Then the queen went on. Jon made a sound that was a choke and nearly became a sob. Tyrion put his face in his hands. Sansa closed her eyes where she was in the tent outside the walls and listened to sound come apart. Lyanna did not do any of those. She put her hand up like a boy stopping a cart horse and shouted so loud the men nearest flinched. "No," she said to her own. "We do not go. Shields up. Line. Anyone who runs forward runs through us first." Grey Worm struck a Lannister with a spear whose blunt end had been sharpened since morning. The Unsullied moved like sewing needles through cloth. Lyanna stood her ground with 100 northern men who wanted, more than anything, to run off their fear by doing something. She made them do nothing except make a wall. The Dothraki went past them like wildfire. Men screamed. The sky hissed with heat. Ash fell thick and soft as lamb's wool. A girl came into the space behind Lyanna's line, bloody and ash-gray, not more than 8 years old. She had a wooden horse in her hand burned to a nub. Lyanna took the horse and put it into the girl's other fist. She looked over the shields. She saw Grey Worm watching them, watching her. He and she were two poles hammered into the earth to keep something of the tautness of life in the middle while the rope burned. He looked away. That was mercy, or it was calculation. She could not tell and would not waste time guessing. She pushed the girl between boots. "Go," she said. "Find the river." When the fire had nothing left to feed, silence arrived in ragged breaths. The city smoked and broke and lay. Daenerys stood above the red keep with the dragon's wings opening behind her like night. And Jon looked up from a street where a woman had fallen around the shape of a child, and he looked at Lyanna as if to ask what to do when duty and love and horror drew a man in 3 directions. "Do your loneliness," she said softly, to him and to herself. "Do it all the way. Don't leave it half done, because then we'll have burned for nothing." She had never told him what to do with a knife before. She had always told him what to do with men. This was a knife. It was not her knife. He could see that in her face, and he loved her for keeping her own counsel. When all of it had broken, when Jon stood in another cold room, more foreign to him than any room in the south, with a body that had been the Dragon Queen in his arms and his face a ruin that would not mend, Lyanna took his hands and told him where to put them, gently like instructing a man new to a task that was good for him. She stayed with him while the words fell, the heavy, tedious, saving words that made what had happened part of something the living could survive. Bran Stark chosen because he did not want the thing, and because he had been everything when the world turned, and because naming him meant the North could take what it wanted and be left alone. Sansa crowned. Arya sailed. Jon sent north to the wall because there had to be somewhere to put him that was not dead and not king. Lyanna led the northern men home along the King's Road. She did not celebrate. She counted the boots that did not come back. She buried the memory of those who did not return beneath more work, because that was how you carried weight without letting it break you. When she came within sight of Bear Island, the gulls sounded like they always had. The sea rasped at the stones and made no allowance for any legend she might have woven. She was 12 when she had taken the title of Field General, and 15 when she returned from war with scars on her ribs she had asked the Maester not to speak of. She stood in the hall where Jon had first given her a thing that had not existed, and she did what northern girls did in halls. She told men where to put the benches for supper and where to start the new palisade when the old one had rotted under snow. She sat with her back to the fire and put her hands out to the heat, and when the old women sang, their voices sounded the same as they had to her when she was very small, and being a general had been a game she did not know the rules to yet. Jon came by Long Road the next winter, his beard full of ice, his eyes softened by exile. He stood before the carved table and smiled the way men who have lost a thing smile when they find a place to set their loss down. She saw how Tormund's raids and the wall's silence had printed on him, and she saw how the sameness of the far snow had held him together when other things might have come apart. He told her things about trees that grew bent and about men whose jokes wore out the same way a boot's heel did, and she told him about grain stores in the rills and the way the wolves had come down from the hills early that year. They sat with their elbows on the old board and moved pine cones for no reason except that their hands remembered. They didn't speak often of the past. They didn't need to. "Would you do it different if you could?" he asked once, half laughing, half not. Lyanna gave him a look that he had learned to value. "If I could do it different, I'd have stopped the snow when it started," she said. "Since I can't, I did what I could where my boots stood." He nodded. The surf hit the stones outside with the steadiness of a heart. He put one finger on the map and traced south to Winterfell and further south to the Broken City and back up again. His finger hesitated over the place the wall had been. He let his hand fall, a small thing that meant everything and nothing, and Lyanna pretended not to see. Word of her went out with the traders and the gossip-mongers the same way news always travels. Changed a little by each tongue and made into better tale by each ear. They said the bear girl commanded like she had invented commands. They said she had once stared down an army and made it sit. They said she had stabbed a king of winter through the eye with a roasted chicken bone. She did not trouble to correct any of it. A myth is a tool like a spear, and sometimes it throws farther than an arm will. She trained girls in the yard with ice in their braids and red faces, calling out numbers. Not names, not pretty words, just the numbers of the drills so their bodies would learn to work as if they belonged to something outside themselves. She learned a way to mark time that was not by battles. The first fish, the first light on the horn of Deepwood. The first day when a man came from the rills with a sack of onions that had not sprouted through their own skins and the smell made the hall shout. She learned to let herself smile when the place she had kept standing stood without her pushing on it. Years later, when the maester at Winterfell took it into his head to write a list of the oddities the North had seen since the time of the bastard's kingship, he put Lyanna Mormont's name on it and scratched the quill so hard he blotted the page. He tried first to call her a heroine and then crossed it out and wrote general with a capital that looked like a spear. He wrote that she had changed the way northern men stood in lines and the way northern women stood outside them. He wrote that she had made the sound of horns into a language. He wrote, grudgingly but truly, that when the snow came again in some century that none of them would see, the bear's line would lift and the horns would speak in the old notes and the men and women who heard them would know where to put their feet. Lyanna did not read that page. She was busy with smaller things. She was busy with a cook fire that would not take, and with a girl whose hands would not stop shaking when she held a spear, and with a boy from across the water who had fallen in love with the way the North did not brag about how hard it was to live there. She was busy with a ship's cargo of honey from White Harbor that had to be counted in jars because men will swear that 12 is 10 when you aren't watching. She was busy with the way the light fell through the smoke in the hall on late winter afternoons, making Eve and rough benches look fine. One evening, in a busted spring when the snow had softened just enough to be treacherous, she walked up onto the bluff where the wind was knife cold and looked out at the gray water. She had become, in the way a shore is, something that doesn't move unless it is falling. She thought of the boys she had sent across fields and could not bring home and the girls who had laughed when their torches took at the first strike. She thought of Rickon's hair blowing on the snow. She thought of Jon's scarred hands, of Sansa's eyes that never forgot a promise, of Arya's knife that had found a place it had been meant for since the world was young. She thought of the dragons and whether men would ever be simple again. She let the wind burn her cheeks raw and told it to carry her gratitude to wherever men go when they die. The wind didn't promise. It rarely did. In winter, after dark, when the old ones in the hall had tired of telling the same stories twice and the children had yawned themselves into sullen wakefulness, someone would remember the way the girl from the island had stood before lords and told them what to do as if they were kitchen girls with ewers. They'd remember the battle where the neat lines broke on ditches and the way the bells sounded when a city should have been spared and was not. They'd remember the small star that was Lyanna in the yard where the snow burned like salt. Whether the story was true or the story had grown out of truth didn't matter much. It gave the little ones a map. It gave those old enough to have bled something to forgive. It gave the North a way to tell itself what it was. On the worst nights, when sleep wouldn't come and the sea seemed like a voice talking and not saying anything a person could answer, Lyanna went down to the stables and let the stallion called Wet Wind breathe into her palm until his lips tickled. She thought of the first time she had stood on a stool to look at a board and called a plan a plan. She thought of all the times after when she had not been ready and done the work anyway. She had learned to forgive herself for being a child when she had to rule, and to forgive the world for not waiting for her to be older. The world rarely waits. You can make it stand a while. That was the thing. Make it stand long enough to do the piece that is yours. Then let go and trust that someone else will take the next piece up. One October morning when the sea light was thin and the crows were fat and disrespectful, a rider came from Winterfell with a letter sealed in blue wax. Lyanna broke the seal with her teeth because she didn't like to have to call for a knife when she wanted to know a thing. The letter said that a winter had begun to soften and the road to the Vale was passable by cart again, and there was an idea in Bran the Broken's head about sending men to chart a new watch, not at the wall but scattered across the neck and the rills and the Sheepshead Hills, to listen for the kinds of noises that are only dangerous to people who have forgotten what they mean. The king asked her what she thought. She took a pine cone from the basket beside the hearth and set it on the table. She cut a piece of driftwood to make a small ship. She set both on the table where the old map no longer lay because the board had bowed so badly when a boy spilled a pot of stew on it that it had been relegated to the wall. She looked at the space between the pieces the way she had at 10. She saw the shape of a plan where none had been 2 minutes before. She dipped a quill, made her answer, sanded it. She told the king the truth, that the North had learned to watch without being told, but that they would listen better when asked. She told him she would make a list of men and women whose ears were good. She told him to send no one to watch a river who had never seen a flood. She told him to keep the watch light and portable and not to give it a dramatic name, because names grow awkward and then you can't afford to move them. At sunset, after the ravens had flown, after she had watched their black shapes shrink to points against the flat gray of the sky, she went out again to the bluff and breathed. Somewhere far north, Jon was sitting on a rock, squinting at the place where the wall had been. Somewhere east, Arya was choosing a star to steer by. Somewhere south, Sansa was lifting the weight of a crown that fit her like a yoke she had chosen and therefore was less heavy than it looked. Somewhere, the dragons were only stories that mothers used to frighten children who wouldn't come in from play before dark. Lyanna stood with her hands tucked under her arms for warmth. The tide changed. It always did, and that was one of the reasons to go on. She thought about how a battle is a very fine word for a day that is a very long creature. The North had other kinds of battles now, the kind you fought with ledgers and with patience and with knowing the deer's path even when the deer had no idea it made one. She would fight those until she was too old to stand in snow without her knees complaining, and then she would sit and teach a younger girl when to lift the horn and when not to, and that would be another kind of battle that was better than any charge. She was not made to be content, exactly. She was made to be at rest in the work she had chosen. There is a difference, and it is a good difference. When the wind became a knife again, she went inside and shut the door on it. And the door made the soft thud a door makes when its timbers are sound and its iron hinges are oiled and the hall behind it is warm enough to sting your face when you come in from the cold. She took off her gloves and held her hands to the fire until she could feel where her blood went. Then she picked up the wooden horse that had sat for a long time on the shelf above the hearth, its burnt head smooth under her thumb, and she considered where to place it on the table next.